Does it matter how we dress? And how do our fashion choices intersect with our political and economic systems? Derek Guy is a writer and commentator on men's fashion. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Esquire, and many other publications, and he goes by the handle Dye Workwear on Twitter. And Derek joins the podcast to discuss what politicians should think about when they make fashion choices, why craftsmanship is disappearing from clothing, the morality of sweatshops, and much more. As always, thank you for listening. We would appreciate if you would drop us a subscribe, a like, a comment, a rating. All of those things are greatly appreciated. And if you really enjoy the podcast, please consider supporting us by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org/become a member. Members get access to exclusive bonus episodes of the podcast. They get a snazzy new membership card, and they get access to our private Slack channel where we organize, talk about the news of the day, and much more. Thank you to all of our supporters, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me in this episode is Derek Guy. Derek, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
This is a really interesting podcast because normally we're dealing with somebody who is an expert in some subject, and I think that applies here as well. But typically we're going in some sort of very nerdy direction, like, so an economist who studies the minimum wage, or some sort of researcher who's tracked immigration, or some political scientist who knows a lot about Ukraine. And it's all these hot button topics. But today we're dealing with something that is a little bit more, on the arts and culture side, but I think has real implications for a lot of how our economy works and a lot of how our politics works. And that is fashion. Why do people dress the way they do? So I want to start out with just a super, super high level question, because you talk about the way people dress and the way men dress specifically. You are almost exclusively a menswear commentator. I know every once in a while you'll talk about women's wear, but I think it's pretty exclusively menswear. But the question I want to start out with is, why does it matter how we dress? And maybe we can even get into, why does it matter how politicians dress? This is something you obviously put a lot of thought into, but what's your theory of why any of this matters at all?
Well, I actually don't really think it matters that much how you dress. I consider myself just a hobbyist and enthusiast. So I'm into this stuff because it's fun and I enjoy it. But I have two positions on the question of why does it matter how we dress. One is that it is true that people will judge you based on how you dress. So as you move through the world, it can be sometimes in certain situations, especially depending on your position in society, to keep that in mind. So someone like Bill Gates, it probably doesn't matter because everyone knows who he is when he walks into a room. But if you are not Bill Gates and you're walking into a room, sometimes if you're going to a job, or let's say you're going to some kind of ceremony like a wedding, it can be, good to keep in mind that people will sometimes judge you based on your dress. However, I also strongly that we as individuals should never judge another person's inner qualities based on how they dress. So it depends on which side of the equation that you're on. If you're talking about how you decide to dress, sometimes in certain situations, it can be good to keep in mind that people judge you. But it should not matter when you look outward and see other people. You should never judge their inner qualities. They're more important inner qualities, I should say. It's fine to say that someone is a Dodgers fan if they wear a Dodgers jersey, but you shouldn't think that someone's more competent or moral or capable or intelligent just because of what they're wearing. As for why politicians should think about how they dress, I don't think that anyone should judge a politician's work based on their attire. I think it's, if you're voting for people, you should vote for people based on their policies and their work, not based on how they dress. And it's perfectly possible and fine to dress poorly and also do good work. But as a politician, when you are campaigning, or even just performing your job, it can, again, be good to keep in mind how you dress, not because dress is the most important thing, but because sometimes it takes important airtime away from your message. So, I think of, for example, when Marco Rubio was running for the nomination for his party for the presidency, he showed up at some point walking to, I think it was his tour bus or something, wearing Cuban-heeled side-zip boots, just not even like a crazy thing. But he wore slim jeans, a quarter-zip sweater, and side-zip boots. And for about a week in national headlines and on social media, all the comments were about Marco Rubio side-zip boots, which, for a kind of a week is a long time in a presidential primary, and that's time away that people could be talking about your message. So I think as a politician, you just keep that in mind, that you never want your clothes to then become the focus of attention, because clothes are ultimately not that important.
The thing that always comes to my mind when we have this conversation is John Fetterman. And I'm of two minds about this, because for background, for those of you who are not like chronically online in the same way Derek and I probably are, John Fetterman has a habit of, we'll say, dressing down, to put it lightly, in very formal settings where, he'll be wearing a hoodie and like sweat shorts or something on the floor of the Senate. And people debate like, oh, it's fine. We need to not be so stuffy in this old institution, that's filled with 80-year-old white men or whatever. And other people think he's disrespecting the institution, and he should, he's a senator, act like it, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know. I can kind of see both points of view there. And even with what you talk about with like, what message are you sending? Because sometimes you actually deliberately want to send a countercultural message, like you mentioned with Bill Gates. It doesn't matter what he wears. And there's even a famous line, I think, in the Social Network movie about how Mark Zuckerberg wears his hoodies and his fuck you flip-flops. And he does that almost intentionally to prove that, like, he's Mark Zuckerberg. He doesn't have to dress nicely because he's the genius. And he's sending kind of a different kind of message there. And I wonder, like, is Fetterman sending a message that almost resonates with blue-collar people, like, I'm more like you? Like, how do you interpret the messaging or the public relations of how Fetterman dresses?
I don't think he dresses that way to send a message, to be honest. I think my impression is that he's just uncomfortable in his own skin, and he probably knows that suits don't fit him very well because of his build. He's, just a giant of a man. And every time he wears a suit, he looks bad in the suit because ready-to-wear suits don't fit him very well. I think his suits may even be made to measure. But the problem with made to measure for someone of that build is that you have to fit pretty within batting distance of the block pattern. Block pattern, the word pattern refers to the kind of architectural blueprint of a garment. Every garment, whether ready to wear, bespoke, or made to measure, will have a pattern. And with made to measure, you can only adjust the pattern so much before you throw off proportions. And I'm pretty sure that his suits are made to measure, because definitely no ready to wear garment's going to fit him. But even his made to measure suits don't look that good. And it would take a bit of effort and time and patience and trial and error to get him into a suit that looks right. And he probably knows that. When you see him in suits, he doesn't look good because the suits don't fit. I wrote a piece for Politico during that kind of like, there was a period when the Senate changed its rules to allow essentially Fetterman to enter the chamber in his usual mesh basketball shorts, hoodie garb. And it caught a lot of flack on Twitter. And it's because I think many people misunderstood my point. I think that John Fetterman should put on a suit because his attire is a constant distraction from his work and his message, whatever you think of his work and his message. My only pushback is that we should not place so much importance on attire that we think that necessarily wearing a suit is some great show of respect to the Senate, or that's indication of the quality of your work. Again, independent of whatever you think of his work, and I would say that of any Republican as well. I mean, there are Republicans that go into not only the Senate chamber, but also into the Oval Office in dress sneakers. And I think it looks atrocious. But
just to make sure that I understand your point correctly, I would sum it up as something like, fashion doesn't matter in the end. What you do is much more important than what you wear. But recognize that even if we believe that ideal, other people will judge you for your fashion, and therefore you need to not let it be a distraction.
Yeah, I would say so. But, that doesn't necessarily mean that you always have to dress according to these kind of like respectability norms. I think it's fine to also dress according to all sorts of, styles that are not even considered respectable. I think that's fine. As long as you just keep in mind that sometimes people will judge you based on this. And again, on your side, never judge the inner qualities of other people based on their attire. And that was my thing with Fetterman is that, he should put on a suit because we are constantly talking about how he wears basketball shorts and it just essentially doesn't matter. But I just take a very strong stand that we should not judge the quality of someone's work or whether or not they respect their position based on their attire because those are fundamentally not that important.
I think that's fair enough. So one of the things that has kind of vaulted you into online fame, and we can get into how weird online fame is as a concept if we want to, but it's kind of the mixing of political figures and fashion advice. And you'll have many of these kind of long threads on Twitter. Twitter is where I know you best from, although I know you're active on other, social media platforms and you do a lot of independent writing. But you'll have these long threads about some particular set of advice, why you shouldn't wear your suits too tight is a common theme. But you'll do it through the realm of some culture war figure, either a conservative politician or some kind of, I don't know, like alpha male podcast influencer type. How did you kind of hit on that formula of like, I'm going to talk about this really, really kind of deeply technical, almost nerdy fashion advice through the realm of something that's going to push people's buttons because it's like this culture war thing?
Well, my feeling is that you should never criticize a regular person. So I would never take a photo of someone on the street or take a photo of someone's private, personal Instagram and say, look at how this like normal dude is dressed poorly. I think that's very bad taste, whether you have a large account or not. Even if you have a small account, I just think that is, fashion is unique in that I can criticize your taste in music, clothes, or I criticize your taste in music or books and films. But criticizing someone's dress sense is very personal because it literally sits on our body, and it's almost like criticizing someone's like face. It's so personal. So if I'm not going to put up a photo of just like a normal dude that's just putting himself out there, I do think that it's helpful to put up a photo of a bad outfit to say, compare these two things. Otherwise, I think sometimes people don't really see the difference. So if I have to choose somebody, I choose figures that I personally am not very sympathetic about. So I feel less bad putting up a photo of Matt Gaetz than I do putting up a photo of, John Smith or whatever off Instagram. So yeah, I mean, I don't really consciously, I guess I think some people think that my views on clothes are defined by the person who I'm posting as the bad figure. And there are some times where I'll comment on someone because I think it's funny. But I always try to keep it to just purely famous people, people who have essentially put themselves kind of in the spotlight or something. To me, that is less, I don't know how to put it. To me, that's less morally wrong than pulling someone's photo for criticism. And I think everyone does that. I don't think I'm the only person that does that. People for all, across Twitter for years have posted photos of people and said, oh, this outfit is ugly. It's just that I will point out the technical and historical reasons for why an outfit is wrong. Whereas other people just say like, oh, this jacket looks stupid or that tie looks dumb or whatever. And there's that famous tweet from Donald Trump. I think he was criticizing Barney Frank or someone who said, you can see his nipples through his shirt. I mean, that's essentially what I do, but I'll say, well, that's because the shirt is this gram weight and it's this weave, and it's because of this cut and this fit. And if you don't want this to happen, here's how you avoid it.
Really do hate, by the way, how funny Donald Trump used to be on Twitter. He's gotten more just deranged recently, but it really pains me to say that he actually was extremely good at Twitter back in the day. Not that that's relevant to anything, but and another thing that strikes me just about the style of posting, and sometimes I can't help but talk about like deeply internet-y stuff, is that you really do seem to try to like it's not a secret where your kind of political sympathies lie. You mostly criticize people on the right for their fashion sense, and that's fine because, you know, they're public figures. But you do seem to stay pretty strictly in, you know, where the criticism stays in the lane of fashion. Are you ever tempted to just take one of these threads and also go off on them on the political topics that they're terrible about? Or do you find it pretty easy to just, no, I'm just going to stick in my lane and, you know, I'm fine doing that?
I mean, I'm sort of the view that people's political views are shaped by larger forces, socioeconomic class, family background, so and so. And they're so deeply identitarian that I don't feel that me commenting on some policy is going to change someone's mind. I don't think they're going to be like, oh, I read this thoughtful critique on Twitter, so like I'm going to vote differently now. I mean, you know, I do think discourse matters, but I mean, I don't think me adding to discourse is going to make a difference. So I don't feel compelled to. There are some issues that I have thought about writing something on that are very important to me, but mostly, you know, to the degree that I talk about politics, I talked about, for example, the Fabric Act on Twitter, which is a federal bill that's going through Congress to protect garment workers. So most of the legal things I'll talk about have to do with fashion. I don't feel particularly pressured to speak on other political issues. There are some political issues that I think dovetail with labor rights, particularly within the garment industry, such as immigration. How do we protect both legal and illegal immigrants in this country? Because I think they are exploited within the garment industry. But I try to stick within fashion, I suppose.
I'd love to get into some of the issues, the kind of the political and economic issues within, you know, the fashion industry and within the clothing industry. One of the things that I know you talk a lot about and that kind of sits highly in your mind is craftsmanship and the sense that a lot of people have that craftsmanship is disappearing, and both from our clothes and potentially in other areas of life as well. I'm curious if you have a sense of why this is, or a kind of a broad theory of why we care less about craftsmanship perhaps these days. You know, it's just as a fact, you know, people are spending less and less of their income on clothing compared to previous generations. I think if you go back to like the 1950s or whatever, 1940s, people spent something like 12, 13% of their income on clothing. And today it's more like 4 or 5% in the US. And part of that is just we're getting richer, you know, but
with that small expenditure, our closets are bursting. We've never had larger wardrobes than today. When you look at early 20th century, mid 20th century wardrobes, men had fairly small wardrobes that they kept for a very long time, and they spent a lot of money on. But now we spend less, but we have so many clothes that things don't even get worn. We have like, you know, people have like storage boxes full of T-shirts that they haven't worn in years.
So why is that? Do you have some grand theory of why this is, or just what the contributing factors are?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big contributing factors is clothing has gotten a lot simpler over time. So in the you know, if you look at early 20th century, men wore suits and sport coats, and over the course of the 20th century, clothing essentially became simpler and simpler. If you look at women's dresses, for example, a woman may have worn in the mid 20th century a dress with, you know, complicated pleats and panels, maybe a self-tie belt, all sorts of construction methods went into the making of a dress. And a lot of that now has been replaced with t-shirts and jeans, which are relatively simple garments. A t-shirt has, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 panels or 5 components. You have 2 sleeves, front, back, and then the collar. Those are sewn together using a straight seam, and it's not a very complicated garment. So the fact that clothing has become simpler has made it possible for clothing to become cheaper, and there's less craft that goes into a t-shirt. I mean, there's only so much kind of craftsmanship you can put into a t-shirt versus when you look at, for example, a suit jacket has multiple layers of canvas, padding, hair cloth, complicated pad stitching techniques, darts. It's just a much more complicated garment. So there's the fact that clothing has become simpler. That's one component. 2 is that globalization and importation of cheaper garments has meant that people buy cheaper and cheaper clothes. And then 3rd is that craftsmanship, like real, true kind of crafted quality garments, have become much more expensive compared to people's income, because to produce those clothes, often, especially in domestic countries, they take up the price of that garment has gone up relative to people's income because of like almost cost disease, for example. A garment worker has to be paid more nowadays because let's take, for example, a bespoke tailor.
I was going to say this almost reminds me of childcare, and that it's, childcare is one of those things that it's really, really expensive these days, and partially because you can't automate it. Like you need at least one person for every 4 or every 6 children or whatever it is. And like, you can't just, there's no, at least to this point, there's no kind of like way to be like, well, one person can now watch 40 children. Like it just doesn't work that way. So as wages rise and as we become richer, childcare is just going to keep getting more expensive as well. And I wonder, you think that same thing applies to really carefully handcrafted clothing?
Yeah, it's essentially you can't scale it. So it took essentially to make a bespoke suit today, more or less costs or takes the same amount of time as it did 100 years ago. There are some parts of the garment production system that have been made more efficient. For example, many bespoke tailors now use block patterns, which is a pre-made pattern that they'll adjust to kind of fit the customer. That's even on the bespoke side. Many will also use prefabricated shoulder pads, whereas in the early 20th century, they would have made the shoulder pads by hand. The way that they construct pockets now, for example, there are pocket machines. There's one guy on Savile Row that does pockets for many of the tailoring houses. So there have been some efficiency gains, but for the most part, you cannot scale a bespoke suit or a bespoke shirt or bespoke trousers the way that you can do for other things. And as those efficiencies have, as we've seen those efficiencies in other sectors, the cost of making those other kind of less efficient sectors become more expensive because those people also have to pay rent and food and all these other things. So I don't necessarily think that everyone has to buy a bespoke suit or bespoke shirt and all of that stuff.
And they couldn't, because any individual person can figure out how to buy a bespoke suit. But if everyone tried to buy a bespoke suit, there would just be a line at the tailors, about 1 million people long, right? We don't have the capacity for everyone to buy one.
Well, if there were more people buying, then you'd have more people taking up the tailoring trade. I mean, part of the reason why the tailoring trade is dying is because not enough people are buying this stuff. So the wages to be a tailor or a shoemaker are so low, and it's such an uphill climb that you'd have to be nuts to enter this trade. So that's part of the reason why even on Savile Row, some of the big firms don't always put out the best work, because they have to make, and I don't know the exact numbers, but they have to put out a certain number of suits per year because they have a lot of clients. But the output just, frankly, is often not as good as a smaller shop that only has to put out, let's say, 50 suits per year. Because that one smaller shop can find the necessary tailors to, in bespoke production, you have essentially 2 types of people. You have the cutter, who's the person that measures and drafts and then cuts, the pattern. And then you have, either the trouser maker or the coat maker, which is the actual person that's called a tailor in the tailoring trade. If you're a tailor, you are the person who's taking those cut pieces of fabric and sewing them together to make a basic garment. And then it goes through a series of fittings to make sure the garment fits right. But in any case, the reason why many of the even large firms are putting out bad work is because they can't find skilled tailors, which are the coat makers and the trouser makers. Finding those people is very difficult. There just aren't enough people who are dumb enough to go into this trade. And I say dumb because it's just such an uphill climb. You have to be so idealistic and so in love with this craft that you're willing to take. It's sort of like entering academia. You'd have to be crazy to go into academia. And it's the kind of same issues.
Yeah. There's a couple things that strike me here. The first is just that it is really interesting how we've automated so much of fashion technology. And like you can almost make a sense that some of the most important technologies in human history are related to fashion, and just in terms of, how we weave fabric today compared to what we used to do. And, so much of that has been automated, and we can now make clothes for so cheap. Have you ever read a book called The Fabric of Civilization?
No.
It's a book by Virginia Postrel, who's this economist. It's just kind of a history of fabric, basically, and how we used to make it back in pre-civilization times all the way up to the current day. And one of the things that she does is she talks about like a modern pair of jeans, just standard blue jeans. It would take something like 100 hours just to spin the fabric, or just to, get the fabric prepared from the threads to make a modern pair of blue jeans, because it's something like 6 miles of thread go into a modern pair of blue jeans. And that doesn't include washing the fabric. It doesn't include any of the actual weaving or dyeing or constructing the pants. Just to make the fabric would be 100 hours. And, today you can buy a pair of blue jeans for, half an hour's wage in the United States or something like that. And so it's remarkable to me how much we've automated so much of this, while there really is no automating the real quality bespoke stuff. There's still some stuff that we just have no idea how to make it any better when it comes to just really carefully handcrafting stuff.
There are some large efficiency gains. And again, craft is sort of a loaded term because people automatically think it's good. I'll give you an example. When you're constructing a suit, there is a technique called pad stitching, which is essentially lifting multiple layers of fabric and sewing them together, but building in shape. So if you stack 3 pieces of fabric on top of each other and you lay them on a table, it will be essentially flat. But if you pad stitch them, you can essentially build shapes, so then all of a sudden the 3 layers of fabric take on a 3-dimensional form. That can be like a curve. It can be, essentially you're forcing the fabric to shape itself in some way that does not lie flat on the table.
You talk about this a lot with like lapels and men's suits, for instance.
Yeah. So in a tailored jacket, pad stitching goes around the chest and the lapels, and that's essentially what forms this kind of the shape on your body. That's not the natural shape of your actual natural body. So anyway, in a bespoke workshop, this is done by hand. Ideally, it's done by hand. But you can actually do the same effect using a machine. There are machines where you can pad stitch the garment. And if you watch people do this, they're almost like it almost looks like they're feeding paper through a fax machine. It just they're feeding the paper in, and this machine kind of goes back and forth, sort of like a typewriter, and stitches the stuff together. And then you have essentially 3 layers that are shaped. If you were to put these 2 things side by side, first off, I would note that there is bad pad stitching. I mean, it's a skill of the person. So if I pad stitch something, it's going to look bad. So if you put my pad stitching next to a machine pad stitch garment, mine will definitely look worse. If you put a skilled tailor's pad stitch garment next to a machine pad stitch garment, I'm not totally convinced that even the trained eye could spot the difference. certainly the layperson would not be able to spot the difference. And to the degree that you could spot the difference, it depends on the fabric. Sometimes very lightweight fabrics, you may be able to tell the difference between machine and hand pad stitched. With heavier fabrics, I have a hard time believing anyone, even a skilled tailor, would be able to tell the difference. So why would anyone want a hand pad stitched garment? Would be because you as an individual care about craftsmanship. Not that craftsmanship has some inherent benefit or quality, and not because that the person necessarily got paid better, but it's because you may care about the quality of craftsmanship. And a friend of mine, Jeffrey Dudich, who works at as the head pattern maker at Hickey Freeman, now I guess it's called the Rochester Garment Factory, they rebranded, but he put it in a very good way. If you were to hang the Mona Lisa in your home, and if the prices were the same, would you want a hand-painted duplicate of the Mona Lisa, or would you want a computer, like just printed out of an inkjet printer version of the Mona Lisa, assuming that you couldn't tell the difference? Many people, if the prices were the same, would prefer the hand version because the hand version represents, something about craft. It's a testament to the skill of the maker. That gets into a very kind of like philosophical point of why someone might care about craftsmanship, even if you can't tell the difference, even if both sides are paid the same, is that craftsmanship sometimes carries some kind of quality that we care about, some kind of like humanist quality that we think is special. But the average consumer may not know.
I was going to say, the one thing that I'll say there is that I agree with that in the abstract. I kind of agree with your hypothetical, and I like the way it's set up. It's a good setup for a hypothetical. But I also feel that when given the choice in the real world, if you offer somebody the opportunity to buy something, a cheap pair of jeans for $20 or a more handcrafted version for just even a little bit more expensive, they take the cheaper option every time. And and I'm curious, like, is that a bad thing in your mind? Should we discourage that, or should we be discouraged by that? Or is this just another instance of, well, fashion is all people can dress however they want, and we shouldn't judge them for it?
That's difficult. That's a difficult question to answer. Your question brings to mind when American Apparel went through bankruptcy some years ago. Dove Charney was ousted out of the company, and American Apparel, I think some people may remember, was like that kind of like sleazy t-shirt kind of company in the early 2000s that was like super popular with hipsters and all that. So at some point they went out of business. They were built on the promise of American manufacturing, and they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They got bought up, I think, by the same company that owns Gildan, some other like big t-shirt company. And they ousted Dove Charney, and then they tried to revive the business. And when they bought it, there was all of this debate on whether or not they should stick to the original manifesto of the company, which is Made in America. So they did a test on their website. They manufactured some shirts in America, and then they manufactured some t-shirts through their usual global supply chain. And they promised that both the t-shirts were identical. And that's believable because, it's a t-shirt. It's not like some crazy garment. It's, it's not that difficult to make a t-shirt. So they put up these two things, and they did this for hoodies and some other things, sweatshirts and they put up these two options on their website. And they said, we promise that the global supply chain is made through meets our standards for ethical manufacturing and is the same quality, the same fabric. It's just that's made in a different country. And the price difference was like pretty marginal. I think the price difference for a Made in America t-shirt was maybe $5 more, and maybe for a sweatshirt is maybe $10 more. It's like not the kind of money that anyone would bat an eye over. And they said, depending on what consumers choose, we will go with that production. And we all know the answer, when people aren't looking, people are going to choose the cheaper option. Do I think that that's necessarily bad? I think it's bad in the sense that I don't have a problem with the importation of foreign clothes. I'm not a nationalist in terms of manufacturing, and certainly making something in America is no guarantee of ethical manufacturing. But I do think that people's propensity to essentially buy whatever's cheapest does not bode well for ethical manufacturing in ethical manufacturing as a whole. People will say that they support labor rights and fair wages on Twitter because that's the easy thing to say. But then when they actually go out and shop, many will buy from Temu and Shein because they offer cheaper prices and trendy clothes. I don't know how to necessarily stop that because I don't know if you can regulate the importation of those clothes in a way that's fair, I suppose. But that's essentially how we end up with the amount of wastage and this kind of trend cycle that we've seen, people cycling through tons and tons of clothes, downward pressure on garment wages, not only for the people in those factories that produce fast fashion, but also across the sector. When you can import a really cheap, trendy t-shirt, that puts downward wage pressure even on the factories that are trying to do things right and pay workers a minimum wage. It's hard to manufacture t-shirts in America on any scale because you can get a cheap t-shirt for $2. So yeah, I don't think it's great because the reality is most people are going to essentially just respond to prices, even if they say they care about ethical manufacturing.
I suppose this gets into kind of the larger debate that's been taking place for many, many years over the nature of sweatshops. And kind of this is sometimes framed as, are sweatshops good or bad? And I dislike that framing because I don't think anybody really claims sweatshops are good in the global sense. But I guess it's,
some do. Some do claim that. But anyway, go on. Yes.
Maybe. I mean, I think it's a matter of, do you frame it as, are they good in an absolute sense, or are they good compared to the alternative? I don't know. I'm really interested by this, but I'm curious if you have any kind of firm stance in that larger debate, because you and I are not the first people to have talked about this.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated, nuanced topic. I think it's fine to recognize that many countries have essentially climbed up the industrialization ladder and produced higher end goods, starting with cheap t-shirts produced using dubious labor standards, and then climbed up. And then as the government taxes those firms, they institute better labor laws because they also have the taxes to enforce those labor laws.
Arguably every country that's ever industrialized has kind of gone through their garment factory phase, whether it's the U.S. or the U.K. in the late 1700s, early 1800s, or whether it's Japan or South Korea, both of which had garment industries for a while, even though we don't really know them for garment industries now. Now we know them for tech. But most countries have been through this phase at some point in another or another.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. had, we had a long phase of building, clothes in this country, and then moved up the ladder of hiring goods. England was known for producing cotton for a while. I think it's a complicated topic because I often think of Chris Laitman. I think he's now at University of Chicago. He's an economist. In a field of very talented people, he's one of the most talented in my mind. But he did an academic paper, I think it was in 2016, where he did a randomized study of various factories in Ethiopia, and found that many of the workers suffered health problems. They didn't stay on the job long enough for them to kind of, develop skills to, go into higher end work. So I think it's fine to recognize that there are some countries that have climbed up. And it's also reasonable to recognize that many countries have kind of been stuck at that stage of production, and the workers have not benefited. I think there were maybe 5 factories that Chris and his co-author looked at. And while the sample size is small, it's a randomized study, and he actually got into the grit of what actually happens at these factories, which I think is very useful instead of these kind of broad generalizations.
So I think I hope you'll forgive me if I pull a menswear guy move here and say that I called your tailor. I've actually chatted. We've had Chris on the podcast. I've talked with him about this study. And I agree with you kind of in the macro sense that the study is a little bit of a pushback on the kind of the universal, like, these sweatshops are always good. They're always better than the alternative. They're not always better than the alternative. But, like, if you ask Chris about this, like, he will still say, well, factories in developing countries are still a really important part of their strategy. And you can't avoid that overall. You just have to be smarter about how you do it. I think that's probably how he would frame the discussion.
Yeah, that would be in line with what I view as well. I mean, when the Rana Plaza collapse happened, I think that was in 2013 or so. When Rana Plaza collapsed, one of the notable things is that the workers did not want multinationals to pull out of the country because they needed those jobs. It's just that I think it's reasonable to also support that, but also want better conditions for workers and to want to see the best for workers. And there are ways that we can at least move in a better direction and care about labor standards, essentially.
Yeah, and I think it's the synthesis there is like, look, if you pulled all the garment factories out of Bangladesh, the average Bangladeshi worker would not be helped by that, right? But right. I also sympathize with people who are frustrated at, why can't the labor standards advance faster than they are? Why can't we put these protections in place faster? And I sympathize with that, and I think we should get them in place as fast as we can, in a way that doesn't, obviously impact all the factories to pull out, because you can't just say, well, they should all make $15 an hour US dollars minimum wage, because then you just wouldn't have factories there. But as much as you can do, you probably should be doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, the protests against, for example, in the 90s, there was a huge anti-sweatshop movement, especially targeted at Nike and The Gap. And out of that anti-sweatshop movement, Nike did improve the conditions of some of their factories. And I think that's the role of consumer behavior, to say, we're not against you manufacturing abroad. I'm not a nationalist in terms of manufacturing, but if you are manufacturing abroad, we would like you to, as much as possible, put forward some type of labor standards. Avery Trufelman did a brilliant podcast episode. People can look it up, I think, by Googling articles of interest sweatshops. And she did a brilliant, or it might be under factory audits. So either Google articles of interest sweatshops or articles of interest factory audits. She did a brilliant podcast episode on why it's so difficult to know what happens inside of these factories. And part of the reason is because factory audits themselves are very flawed. Sometimes workers are coerced to say certain things to keep their jobs. People auditing a factory may not always be doing a good job, so on and so forth. But as much as you can, as a consumer, try to support the companies that are doing good things, and try to put pressure on the companies that are doing bad things to just do better things,
As an aside, did you follow the whole Shein influencer trip to like the factory that they had, and where all those, and it was, what do you call it, like a Potemkin factory, like a happily constructed little village that's obviously fake. And I followed that whole episode, and for people who don't know what I'm talking about, it's like, Shein brought in a bunch of influencers from TikTok and whatever that were famous for doing like Shein hauls, where they buy a bunch of stuff from Shein that's like $5 a piece. And so they'd buy like 50 things at a time. And they brought these influencers over to be like, look how happy our factory is. Look, come talk to these people. Look how happy they are. And it was so painfully fake, man. It was so bad.
Yeah, I felt bad. I didn't want to comment too much on that because one particular woman was getting the brunt of the criticism, even though there were a bunch of people on that trip. And some of the criticisms became very personal about her appearance and all that stuff. I just thought it was like getting a little bit crazy. But there should be criticism for people who are essentially just shilling for companies. And that's not just true for Shein, but across the fashion industry, of how many influencers are essentially just repeating talking PR points. It's bad for Shein. It's especially egregious for Shein because I think they are one of the worst offenders in terms of fast fashion, of pushing this kind of like, this sort of like cheap clothing, trendy clothing. But certainly there are a lot of fashion influencers who are essentially doing nothing more than acting as sales reps and PR agents.
How do you think social media has changed the way that clothes are marketed?
It's such a bummer because 20 years ago, when I started paying attention to online media for fashion, it was such a beautiful scene because fashion brands essentially looked down on like the internet. They thought this was like just not a very chic, cool thing to be part of. So what you ended up having were blogs and forums filled with hobbyists. So people would post like their thoughts on a shoe, and a lot of them were spreading misinformation. Don't get me wrong, because many of them just were not informed on how something was made or whatever. But one thing that you could guarantee is that it was an honest opinion. It was just that guy who was posting because he loves shoes or whatever. And over time, as brands have realized the kind of marketing power of the internet, many of these influencers, even if they catch any kind of like following, they immediately get snatched up they get co-opted by these brands, and then they become shills. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, that word is so overused, but I don't know how else to put it besides that they're shills. One day they're not even like well-paid shills. They'll get like a free pair of jeans, and then all of a sudden on Instagram, they'll say, oh, these are the best jeans in the world. And then next week, they get gifted another different pair of jeans. And all of a sudden now this is the new best pair of jeans in the world. And it's like, what is your actual opinion of any of the stuff? I feel it's kind of ruined the hobbyist, enthusiast pureness of what was a very kind of endearing online fashion community. And I mentioned this once on Twitter and got slammed for it. But it almost seems like the people that are following this stuff cheer it on. It's like, it's this whole kind of like, get that bag, eggs cost a lot of money, rent costs a lot of money, get as much money as you can. And I recognize that it's very expensive to live nowadays. But I also think the people consuming this media should be more critical. Like, what do you mean these are the best jeans in the world? Like, what does that substantively mean? And why are you now promoting these jeans when last week you said these other jeans were the best in the world?
I also share a lot of like nostalgia for the old forum based internet before, social media was big, really, that, we were all on AIM chats and live journals and kind of BBS forums. And I have a lot of nostalgia for that. I was never on like style forum or fashion forums, but I was on different forums, and it was kind of a special time for the internet. I don't know. At the same time, I find it very hard to ever criticize somebody for getting the bag. Like, online fame and online attention is so fleeting. We have no idea. We're so young into the social media existence as a phenomenon. We have no idea what the lifespan of an influencer really is. So like, get the money while you can, but maybe that has poor side effects in the kind of the macro sense.
I feel a weird sense of, like, as an Asian man, like growing up and feeling that you are responsible for taking care of your parents, and like I didn't become a doctor and lawyer. I think about how I was supposed to be the Asian doctor who like bought my mom a big home. And then sometimes I think about how, like, when brands reach out to me, I not only delete PR emails, but I block all PR emails. So if you send one to me, it's just immediate block from the sender's address.
That is extremely pure. That is sticking to your guns, man.
But so then I think, like, but for what end? Like, I don't buy my parents a home because I want to keep it real to menswear. Like that's such a, like, what am I even doing? But I hate the culture of shilling in this kind of community. Yeah, but maybe that's just a foolish move. I don't know.
We've got just a little bit more time. I want to ask, other than the stuff we've talked about right now, we've talked a little bit about kind of labor rights, and I know you've written about labor rights here in the US, and you've advocated for some, labor rights standards in the garment industry. Are there other kind of like political or policy angles that you often take here? I don't know whether it would be like industrial policy to promote certain things, certain kinds of clothing, or whether it would be tariff policy on how we tariff certain kind of garments. Are there other kind of policy areas you think about a lot in relation to kind of the fashion industry?
Well, when the U.S. when the government, kind of passed that bill on TikTok, forcing the parent company to divest, it made me think like the government's obviously willing to take some pretty selective and extreme policy measures. And I don't think that we can do that for Shein or Zara, H&M. But sometimes I don't know what else to do for this kind of situation. Essentially, I think it's bad that we import so many cheap, trendy clothes that encourage such incredible cycles of consumption. So much of our clothing winds up in landfills, not even worn once, some with the tag still attached. And I think that's bad for the environment, and it puts downward wage pressure on garment workers across the industry. But I don't know what kind of policy measures can be taken to do that. It almost doesn't even make sense it would be almost like an absurd ban on fast fashion, because what you're trying to do is target certain kind of practices, and those practices are rampant, not just in fast fashion, but even sometimes in high-end sectors of this industry. It's just that to me, fast fashion is the easiest target because we know bad things are happening when you're selling a t-shirt for $1 or $2.
Yeah, and the other thing that I think of is it's easy to villainize certain people who maybe deserve to be villainized if they're buying 100 items at a time from Shein just to do a TikTok video of I tried on 100 things, and then they probably throw away 99 of them. That person maybe deserves to be villainized, but if we do make stuff more expensive, if we increase tariffs or whatever, there's some working class person in the middle of the country in Missouri or whatever who will not be able to buy their kids new clothing unless they have access to really cheap clothing. And for that person, it's not a waste. It's just, is my kid going to get a new pair of jeans this year? Or are they going to have to keep wearing the old one that doesn't really fit them anymore? And I worry about that sometimes, that we over focus on kind of the social media aspect of performative consumption and forget about the people who it actually really does matter that they don't have to spend as much money on clothing.
Yeah, as a policy matter, it's going to be very difficult to target the difference between buying a Hanes t-shirt, which I think is fine. The Hanes t-shirt is still probably made in questionable conditions, but a Hanes t-shirt is something that you can wear for years because the design has essentially stayed the same for years. And even if it's not the best made t-shirt, it's still something you can wear for years and it's fine. It's hard to allow for that and then target the super trendy t-shirt that is just like trending on Instagram because it has a print of something that's like ironic and funny, and then people are going to buy it and then wear it once and then never again. Like, fish, what is it? Fish fear me and women want to be, like some funny meme saying on a t-shirt.
Yeah. We're going to get, I called your tailor printed on a t-shirt, Derek. That's going to be, and the thing is, if you did that, I bet you would get easily thousands of orders.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that, but yeah.
But no, the whole thing's messed up too, just because, and this is my particular hobby horse, but like tariff policy in this country is really backwards, I think, in that tariffs on low end items that poor people might buy are actually way higher than tariffs on, say, like luxury items. Like a cashmere sweater might have a tariff, and I'm going to get the exact numbers wrong, but it's something in this neighborhood of like 3%. Whereas like a cotton t-shirt has a tariff of like 18%, and then a cotton poly blend gets a tariff of 25%. And I guess that encourages us to buy nicer things, but also it seems kind of messed up that like the rich person buying genuine cashmere, or maybe fake cashmere, I don't know, but either way, like they're paying a lower tax rate than the person buying a cotton poly blend.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with the importation of foreign clothes. So I'm not against foreign manufacturing. I don't particularly have any, allegiance to manufacturing things in America for the sake of manufacturing things in America, as long as things abroad are made under ethical conditions. But targeting that is very difficult, especially since many of these factories subcontract their work to other factories, and it's hard to trace the entire supply chain of who made what, where, and under what conditions. The best that we can do at the moment is just educate consumers and hope they don't do that kind of like American Apparel sleight of hand.
All right. Well, we are coming up on time now, so I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? I will be happy to recommend you should follow Derek on every social media account. His Twitter is dyeworkwear. You can also catch him at dyeworkwear.com. You can, I believe you're an editor at Put This On, a blog, putthison.com. So you should follow Derek. You should studiously study all of his advice. But other than yourself, what would you recommend for people who are interested in what we're talking about today, whether it's just how clothes are constructed or labor issues in the garment industry or any of the stuff we've been talking about? What should people do if they're interested, they want to learn more about all this?
I would say, I don't know if it's gauche to recommend another podcast on a podcast. I hope it's not. But Articles of Interest to me is just one of the best fashion podcasts. There's, I think, maybe 3 or 4 seasons at this point. I would recommend people start season 1 of Articles of Interest, work your way through. I still think season 1 was the best season, and then the other seasons are also good. They're all good. And then recently, in the last year, Avery Trufelman, who is the person who produced and hosts Articles of Interest, has been doing various episodes on social issues. Like she just finished a brilliant article on kind of stuff that Catholic priests wear. There's a brilliant episode on factory audits, size inclusivity, things like that. It's just a really great podcast that introduces fashion in a way that's not just about where someone got appointed in terms of a creative director. A book that some of your listeners might like is Ready-Made Democracy by Michael Zakim. And I don't know if it really dovetails with what we talked about in this episode, but it's a really good book about how the garment industry essentially came up with the development of kind of capitalism and democracy in America and the shaping of our politics. If people are interested in the history of the suit, I really like Christopher Brewitt's book called The Suit. And there are some other authors that I really like. David Marks just came out with a book called Status and Culture, which is a good summation of the sociology of taste. Guka Gronow did another brilliant book called The Sociology of Taste. When I think when you read those 2 books together, as well as Distinction by Bordeaux, you get a sense of why we cycle through the trends in the way that we've talked about in this podcast. And obviously, if with Chris Blakeman's episode on your podcast, Chris has done really great work on sweatshops, and I would just go into CV and see, what he's written on that subject.
Yeah, Chris is great. I highly recommend Chris. He's also gotten into, his most recent book is excellent. He wrote about why we fight, like why conflicts erupt in the first place. It's kind of a switch away from, the sweatshop work, but everything Chris does is great. So,
yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you one more time to our guest here today, Derek Guy. Derek, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me on.